Hey everyone, welcome to the CTO Con 2023. My name is Talha Masood. I'm the co-founder at CTO at remotebase.com. Today's topic is about maintaining security, privacy, and resiliency in challenging times. Sorry, it's a tongue twister for me, resiliency. But honestly, the times are challenging. So we're creating tons of data on the internet every single moment, and then our organizations or the companies out there are more susceptible to cyber attacks and all. So in today's session, we'll be discussing some of the challenges that organizations face while maintaining security and privacy for themselves and their users. And we'll also talk about some of the solutions to those problems. So we have a panel of esteemed experts with us today. We have Ruoting Sun, who's the VP of Product at Secureframe. And then we have Mike D. Kail, who's the CTO at PrimaryIO. Welcome, guys. So good to have you here. Why don't we introduce ourselves? Ruoting, we'll start with you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm Ruoting Sun. I lead the product function at Secureframe. We are a compliance automation platform. So we help businesses of all sizes kind of simplify and streamline their path to getting and maintaining various information security compliance requirements through automating the evidence collection that is associated with it, helping with workflow management between the different teams that are involved, typically as part of a compliance workflow, as well as ultimately helping our customers actually get their compliance. Most of our customers come to us to get security certifications like SOC 2, ISO, HIPAA, PCI DSS, and so on and so forth. So yeah,
nice. Perfect. Thanks for joining us. Mike?
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm CTO of PrimaryIO, which is a Silicon Valley-based startup. We've just gone to market with a disaster recovery as a service platform that's protecting VMware-based workloads, leveraging IBM Cloud as the DR/target site. And as part of that overall data protection offering, we also have a ransomware protection and recovery solution embedded in it that's using immutable cloud object storage, air-gapped, isolated recovery environments, partnering with IBM on their cyber resiliency platform to allow customers to efficiently and safely scan in this isolated recovery environment their data to make sure that what they restore from is free of ransomware. And once they've done that, they can recover back into their environment after that's been cleaned. Typically what we've seen is customers don't know when they've been infected. So we keep metadata as part of our solution of the data protection, and we allow them to recover up into a given date and time point. So they hopefully have some level of guess around when they were infected, and then they can run those battery tests that I mentioned with cyber tool sets. So that's part of our kind of security and compliance, if you will, angle to this.
Pretty amazing, guys. I mean, that's pretty spot on. And let's just jump to the discussion. It's important. So, Ruoting, question for you.
Sure.
What are some of the biggest cybersecurity threats that are faced by the organizations today, and how do you mitigate those?
Yeah, frankly, I think the biggest challenge that a lot of companies face with regards to security today is actually just general security fatigue. I think that we operate in a rapidly changing environment in terms of the number of business tools, developer tools that people can use. If there's a massive kind of trend around product-led growth, right, or PLG. And what that effectively has done is it kind of breaks the procurement cycle that organizations have traditionally had. And a lot of the security sanity checks typically happen within that procurement cycle. And so now you've kind of removed the office of the CISO from the ability to do these types of security sanity checks because so many of these different applications and tools that business users and developers are using are either in kind of a product-led growth motion where the user is actually self-adopting or a B2C to B motion like a Slack or like a Zoom. And I think a lot of times security professionals are just constantly behind the eight ball in terms of having the level of visibility that they really need to have to be able to understand their overall security posture. I think the flip side of this is that there's just an abundance of data and alerts, right? You talk to 10 different CISOs, very few of them are going to tell you that I don't have enough data. What they're going to tell you is I have too much data and I don't know what to prioritize. And there's a widening
100%.
attack surface of ways that potential bad actors and hackers can actually get into the system. So, from my perspective, I think the most important things are, frankly, in terms of mitigating these types of risks, is have the basics in place, right? We talk a lot about security hygiene and then kind of the equivalent of, like, what is the security equivalent of brushing your teeth and flossing every day? Make sure that you have proper onboarding and offboarding for all of your employees and all of your contractors, right? Make sure that you have complete management control over your fleet of devices that you're giving your employees. Make sure you have multi-factor authentication turned on for all of your critical applications, that you're limiting the access of those critical apps only to people that actually need them. Make sure that you do some level of sanity check on the vendors that you're using to really reduce, third-party risk, right? Getting certifications like SOC 2 and ISO are part of that. Get rid of passwords to the best extent that you can, and use identity federation. That's, social engineering and phishing tends to be one of the top threat vectors that I'm sure we'll talk more about in this session. But ultimately, I think right now it's a time where security really is about removing the paths of least resistance. You don't necessarily have to run faster than the bear. You just kind of have to run faster than the slowest person running away from the bear. So,
100%. So, by the way, Ruoting came up with some good terms: security fatigue, security hygiene. So, what are your thoughts here, Mike?
I think Ruoting is spot on, especially with the respect to the hygiene or lack of it. I think it's analogous to me of a fitness program. Like you don't just work out once every month and tick the box and you're fit. Like it has to be continuous. Also like brushing your teeth. Like you can't just brush your teeth once a month and expect to have good dental hygiene, and you can't expect to perform security checks once a month and expect to be secure. I think the other thing that Ruoting touched upon is what I call the layer 8 challenge, meaning the human layer or the employee layer, and the social engineering attacks that happen. Because once again, companies tend to not follow age-old practices such as least privileges, and now zero trust, meaning assume that an employee is going to get hacked or social engineered. What do you do to mitigate that and reduce the blast radius of that? And data, and then protect against data exfiltration, ransomware. The attack vector is always or most often an employee. If you look at even like the brutal hack that LastPass recently had, which is a manager solution, they got into an employee's home computer with a keylogger, I believe, and that person had, probably over provisioned credentials and had full access to different environments. And then you didn't have that multi-factor or multiple layers or defense in depth, if you go back to another age-old term, in place to protect yourself.
Makes sense. And Ruoting, I have a question for you. Like, this all sounds great theoretically, but how much of this is even possible if your teams are working remotely? And with the advent of remote work, everybody's working from anywhere in the world. So how much of this is basically implementable if your whole team is working remotely?
I think it's very implementable. I mean, Mike touched a bit on zero trust security, and one of the kind of I think core principles of zero trust is that you are able to actually enforce those security controls anywhere, on any device, on any application, regardless of whether it's on-prem or it's in the cloud. It's in your cloud or it's in somebody else's cloud. Doesn't matter where the endpoint or the device is, whether it's on your network or it's at a public Wi-Fi at a hotspot at a Starbucks, right? So that is actually a critical component of zero trust security philosophy. I think really what COVID in the last 3 years and the shift to remote work has really done is, in a lot of ways, it's accelerated the death of on-prem security, and the kind of age-old notion of logging into client-side VPNs, the age-old notion of like having a firewall and building kind of a perimeter around your on-prem environment. Really has really gone out the window. It has for the last decade, but I think the notion of remote work and people working from anywhere has really accelerated the death of that. I think the other piece of this that Mike touched on also is just it makes security awareness training a lot more important. And I think that there's some pretty critical aspects to this, right? One is, as Mike mentioned, I think phishing is the number one kind of attack vector into a company. You saw that with LastPass. You see that with a number of recent high-profile breaches. And it's a reason why it's a requirement for a lot of different InfoSec compliance frameworks, right? It's like, but I think more important than just the training and the awareness, I think it's also that we actually fundamentally need a shift in how we think about social engineering and how we think about security as a responsibility, not just of a security team or of a CTO, but it's actually everyone's responsibility and everyone's job within the company. And I think sometimes we have a tendency of making people feel bad if they fail their security awareness training or they fall for a phishing scam. I think the reality is, like, we probably need to remove some of the negative stigma around falling for these types of social engineering attacks, because they're actually designed really, really well sometimes. And just because you fall for one of these things doesn't mean that you deserve to be shamed, or doesn't mean that you should get made fun of, because ultimately it takes away the space for your employees, for the people to feel okay with saying, hey, I fell for this. Now there's a risk to the organization. And I think if that happens, who ultimately pays the price for that information not being shared, or the CISO or the security team not being alerted? It's not the employee who fell for it, right? It's the company at the end of the day. And so I think we need to kind of remove some of the negative stigma that is around it, and also empower all of the individuals, all of the employees in a company to understand that InfoSec is actually the job of everyone in the company. It's everyone's responsibility, and it's not just on the security team.
Not just on the security. So it has to be everyone's responsibility. Mike, what are your thoughts here?
I feel like Ruoting and I discussed this before the call without discussing it before the call, because he's spot on with one of his points. I think, to augment that, fostering the collaborative culture of shared responsibility, and once again, not shaming people for falling for this. Like, oftentimes the security teams, I've seen this in the past and I've experienced it directly. Like, they run some phishing campaign and they make fun or shame the person, and they actually created like a wall of shame. Like, that's the exact opposite approach. With respect to remote work, I mean, I implemented this, or took the stance well over a decade ago. Like, don't assume that your office environment is more secure than your local coffee shop. It's not. Like, there's plenty of attack vectors in your local and office, and just because you have a firewall doesn't mean the firewall is properly configured. Or I'm on my mobile device, I'm not on Wi-Fi, I turn it on to 5G. Now I'm outside of the firewall, so and I can access the same level of apps. So I'll be a broken record on this panel. Implementing zero trust / least privileges is paramount to having a foundational set of security principles and practices to then deliver the continuous hygiene that we spoke about on the last point. And this a virtuous cycle.
And that makes sense as well. To be honest, so Ruoting, there are a lot of things going on right now. We have the GDPR, or we have the CCPA, and what have you. So how can we make sure as a leader that our organizations are compliant? Because truth be told, for me, all of this is a gray area. Like GDPR says one thing, then somebody else comes along and says another thing. So as a leader, how do you make sure that your organization is compliant to at least something?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just a reality of the business environment that we're going into, where data privacy is becoming a bigger and bigger issue. And you're starting to see, I think, different regions and different countries take very different interpretations to what data privacy actually means for their citizens, right? And so even something as broad as GDPR, you tend to think of it as like a global standard, but it gets interpreted very differently depending on the data protection agency of the country within Europe that you're actually talking to. And so I think at the end of the day, people should think a little bit more intentionally about the type of information that they're actually collecting. Think through whether you actually need it or not, right? And this is something that I spent 2 years. I took a little bit of a sabbatical from security and went into e-commerce and spent 2 years in e-commerce. And let me tell you, the types of information that we collect on consumers in e-commerce or in gaming and these types of more consumer-facing industries is pretty concerning. Is probably not the right word, but it's pretty deep, right? And so there's kind of a shift now from collecting as much information about the end user and about the customer as you can, to actually being more intentional about aggregating and anonymizing some of this, and really thinking through whether you actually need the information to run your business. So that's one aspect of it. I think the other aspect of it is that you see a lot of organizations start to shift the burden of that data ownership to kind of centralized brokers, so that they don't have to be the ones to actually have to deal with holding PII.
100%.
And the best, I mean, well, the best example of this is probably actually, if you think about commerce or gaming, the individual kind of Shopify store does not want to hold all of the kind of customer information that they need for targeting and getting new customers. So what do? They go to Facebook, right? And Facebook becomes the kind of central place where everybody actually gives Facebook most of their data. Facebook takes that information and uses it to enrich the kind of targeting schemas that they use. And what you tell Facebook is, I want these types of audiences because these are the types of people that are most likely to buy my product. And Facebook works the magic in terms of making all of that happen. And then you don't actually, you're no longer responsible for a lot of the kind of security and privacy requirements of holding that PII, because you're not actually holding the PII. And so I think there is definitely kind of a shift to offloading this data ownership to centralized platforms that have the scale and the depth and the capability to be able to do much richer targeting than you as an individual would be able to do yourself. But then on the B2B side, I think a lot of it is also about aggregating and anonymizing that data and being really intentional about thinking through what is the business case, what is the use case that you actually have for collecting this data, and how are you actually going to use it.
100%. So Ruoting just said different interpretations, varies from country to country. So what's your take here, Mike?
I think I'll take a simpleton approach to this. I think I view all of these various compliance and regulatory frameworks as applying Sarbanes-Oxley to it, meaning do you do with the data what you say you're doing it? And do you have a repeatable hygiene around it? So eliminating manual processes as much as possible, automating it. So when a regulator comes in and says, look, what are you doing with this data? Where are you storing it? You can say, here's exactly the pipeline of that. With respect to the data privacy topic, I think thankfully with the advancements we've seen in machine learning and artificial intelligence, there's some startups, hyper focused on the redaction of PII, PHI, PCI data, so that you can then run the analysis from the business perspective on these data sets without potentially exposing data that you shouldn't, or personal data. You can still get your do your cohort analysis, customer behavior if you're a Shopify, et cetera, without the risk of exposure. And then rooting kind of this data broker concept. I think we've seen this new hashtag of data SecOps, and a numerous amount of companies / startups being kind of a proxy to make sure, once again, the repeatable automated processes, they can help coordinate those. So I think that the combination of those approaches is how you can solve for regulatory compliance as well as not exposing sensitive data.
Yeah, and Ruoting touched a bit on it as well. Like there has to be a balance between the data you store and then the privacy for the data. So what does that balance look like to you, Ruoting? Like, I know organizations are big on storing data. They want to store each and everything they get interacted with. But what does the balance look like to you? Like how much of the data should we store, and then the privacy in terms of storing that data?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a hard question to answer in the aggregate. I think it's very specific to the individual needs of the business themselves, and really, it's an executive level decision. Oftentimes that you're having to make to say, are we willing to collectively accept the risks of capturing and storing this sensitive information, whether it's PII, whether it's PHI, And so it's a risk management decision, I think, at the end of the day, in my opinion, whether or not it's worth storing the data, whether or not it's worth capturing the data, whether that data actually enriches your ability to be able to do business, whether it enriches your ability to be able to develop your product faster, develop your product better, and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a non-answer, because I don't think that there's a single approach that you can take that perfectly threads the line or balances the need to collect as much data and information about your customers as you can, while at the same time also adhering to the various kind of compliance and privacy frameworks that are out there. There's no single silver bullet that applies for all organizations. I think it's a very intentional decision that typically the GRC functions, governance, risk, and compliance, are thinking through along with the executive teams.
And I agree with you. It varies from company to company. So for us, like, we're a small company and we would never store credit card information. We would rely on PayPal or Stripe or whatever we're using. So what's your take here, Mike? Like, what's the balance look like to you?
I think a key point to make is a lot of people view risk as a static entity or static thing. Risk is going to be highly elastic. And your management of that data will also be elastic. Like, some points of the year, depending on your sector, you may have to collect and store more information because you're an e-commerce site and the holidays or Friday after Thanksgiving is coming up and you want to know more about your customer and track that and keep and get insights and trends. And then after that, maybe that goes away. And then you want to, once again, have hygiene and prune that data after you're done. Don't store it just because you think you may need it at a later date. You can always acquire more data because, once again, that's elastic along with risk. So having a
highly elastic risk, I like that. I'm going to steal that from you. Elastic risk.
So having a continuous cycle of managing your data, purging it, I think is probably the best you can do.
Sounds fair. Ruoting, tough question. Common mistakes that organizations do when it comes to privacy and all.
I think it actually goes back to a point that Mike just made, which is that people tend to view risk as static, and it really isn't. It's very elastic, and I think when we think about it from a security and compliance perspective, I think many organizations look to different types of security certifications as like a gold standard of attestation, and that if you have it, you're good to go, right? And SOC 2. I think in the SaaS enterprise software space is kind of like has become like the de facto marker of trust. And so if you're doing business, it doesn't matter if you're a 5-person startup, doesn't matter if you're a 500-person startup or a 5,000-person enterprise. If you're doing business and you have a cloud or SaaS product that you're offering that you're trying to sell, most companies today will ask you for a SOC 2 type 2. And so the reality is that it's a very simple way to understand whether you've implemented a lot of the kind of basic security controls and security policies as it pertains to information security. But you do your SOC 2 audit once a year. And the look back window on that is 6 to 12 months, right? So actually, the second at which you get your SOC 2, it is already actually out of date because it's a look back, it's not a look forward. And so by definition, I probably shouldn't be saying this as the VP of product for a compliance automation company, but the reality is, there's a ton of compliance and security drift that happen within your organization throughout the course of a year, right? New employees are getting onboarded. They're adding different business applications. They're creating data. They're collecting data. Mike talked about you don't necessarily always have to be on the corporate network. You can be on a 5G connection, which means you don't really have the ability to control or enforce security controls on that data and on those applications to the extent that you would like. And so I think there's much greater need and realization that you actually need kind of continuous monitoring and continuous alerting to be able to manage that security that compliance that happens over time. It's not a static snapshot picture to say, I got my ISO 27001 or I got my SOC 2 done on January 1st. Now I'm good for the year, because the reality is actually your environment has changed as of January 2nd. And I think a common mistake is people don't realize that is the case, or they just kind of accept that risk.
100%. 100%. And as Mike mentioned in his previous answer, that it's sort of a fitness program, like a fitness program. You have to keep it up. So What are your thoughts here, Mike? Like some of the mistakes that you have done in the past?
So I think to riff upon the famous Glengarry Glen Ross quote of always be closing, instead you should always be auditing. Ruoting mentioned like
Always be honest.
you can pass your compliance audit on January 15th, make a change on January 16th, and you're exposed until the next year. And this is always my rant about PCI compliance, meaning payment card industry. If you're collecting credit card numbers, like you pass PCI compliance, you could make a change in your billing and payment system an hour after that, and you're out of compliance and no one would know, and you could expose. So once again, and this goes back to my point about manual processes and the layer 8 challenges. If you have humans involved with manual processes, there's going to be configuration drift, there's going to be errors, and you won't catch them. And then
that sounds fair.
One very tactical thing we didn't touch upon is encryption. And this goes back to data privacy, but even audit and compliance, like lack of proper end-to-end encryption, whether that's in transit or at rest, ideally both, needs to be implemented. But then you have the challenges of key management, encryption key management, and people don't have good hygiene around that. So I think the core takeaway is improve your security hygiene.
100%. And guys, we've been talking about the things that we can do in terms of privacy and all. But what if a data breach does happen? So IBM says that the average cost of a data breach is around $4.5 million US, which is huge. So what are some of the steps that we should take in case a data breach does happen, like Ruoting? What are your thoughts here?
Yeah, this is really tricky, and the kind of prime example that comes to mind is what happened with Okta last year. And it's tricky for a couple of reasons, right? I think that there's this need to balance the accuracy and the precision of the events that occurred with the need to share that information in a quick and timely manner with people so that they can take the kind of appropriate remediating actions on their side. And oftentimes, if you share information too early and it turns out to be the wrong information, and then you have to go back and correct yourself, it's obviously one, really damaging, but also two, it's very confusing for customers. And so I think there's this constant balance of accuracy and precision with timeliness when it comes to a data breach. So obviously you want to do like a full assessment and root cause analysis as quickly as possible to understand what happened. And then once you do that, like you want to make sure that you communicate often about what you actually found out, and the remediating steps that you're taking to address it. But Okta was a great example of this last year, and this is not throwing any kind of shame or FUD on Okta. Like I think they did the best that they could, but they were put in a really tough position of people were asking questions to answers that they either thought they had and then got wrong, or that they didn't have the whole picture. And so I think those are the kind of the two main things I would say is find out what happened, and then once you do, and once you're fairly certain that is what happened, communicate early and often with your customers, with your partners, with your vendors, so that everyone understands the kind of third-party risk that is in the that occurred as a result of that data breach. I think third-party risk management is actually a very big challenge within the InfoSec space, where you have tons of like these message boards and threads between different CISOs of like, okay, I had a security incident. Does this impact these 10 vendors that I work with? And then it becomes kind of this like cascading effect of like everybody is just constantly trying to understand what their third-party risk is and what their exposure is the second that one person gets popped. So I think that's probably the hardest balance to find. And then the other thing I would say is like, obviously make sure you have cyber insurance. It doesn't cover the full damage, but it does help dull the pain to some extent. And the reality is, if you're selling into enterprise software, you probably need it anyways to do business. So make sure that you have adequate cyber insurance coverage.
100%. I'm curious to know, like, what happened to the responsible people at Okta? Like, were they fired or are they still working there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's a, I think ultimately, Todd, who's the CEO of Okta, came out and I think was very forthcoming in terms of stepping through the events of that timeline of the kind of 3 or 4 different notifications that they made, what their assumptions were at the points in which they made them, what they got right, what they got wrong. And so, going back to an earlier point around like not shaming people for making mistakes, I think it's very important to have this culture of like collective responsibility. And when something like this happens, everyone is held responsible. There's no point in kind of pointing out a scapegoat and firing someone or penalizing people.
100%. Yeah, collective responsibility. And we're almost out of time, Mike, but I would love to hear your comments on this one.
Yeah, I'll be succinct. I think having a responsible, transparent disclosure approach is key to this, to allay the fears of your customers. And then I think having a breach plan of action that you actually execute as part of a fire drill periodically, so that you're not caught flat-footed if and when an event does happen. So then you've already kind of run the playbook, and any of your other third-party vendors or partners are aware of this as well. So they're not surprised, and then you don't have that cascading panic effect. Like those are the 2 key ingredients to help with this.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you, Mike and Ruoting, for joining us today. That was a pretty insightful session. I'd like to thank our audience for tuning into yet another episode of CTO Con 2023. Stay tuned for more. Thank you.